Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi, this episode is about work. Not work as a hardship, as something we get compensation for, that we're putting up with. Work we want. Work as an activity we have agency to choose, to identify and engage in. What if we thought about work as a product? What if we were the customers of work, that employers marketed to us to attract and connect us with work that is optimally suited for each one of us? How would your awareness increase about what work you want to allocate your attention to? How would work be designed differently? How would managers' roles change or invert to win the work their teams want to do, adjusting to be more supportive than directive? How can this human-centric reframing of the employee work market enable leaders to improve employees' work choices and organizational dexterity to better adapt to the tech-driven new pace of business and work? I'm delighted to be speaking with Dart Lindsley, Strategic Advisor People Experience at Google. Dart is also a writer, speaker, and host of the Work for Humans podcast. Dart is on a mission to humanize work. Hi, Dart. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic.
Excellent. I start at the beginning, which starts off in Santa Cruz, studying literature and writing.
Right.
How come?
Well, I was an undergraduate for 7 years, and it's partially because my brother told me when I was starting college, he said, never graduate. And I took him seriously. But it's also because I studied everything and I found everything interesting. I got 3 courses away from graduating in economics. And I happened to take some time off and go on a spearfishing trip around Mexico. And I was sitting on a train thinking about what I really wanted to do. And I realized it wasn't economics, although I loved economics. Mm-hmm. And I sat back and I asked myself, what am I actually good at? And most of the things I was good at was not very useful, but I was good at words. And I was a very avid reader and a very capable reader. And I thought, I just need to do what I'm good at and what I love. And so I switched to writing, which was very unpopular with my family.
Okay.
In part because this was, I don't know, at least year 4 of my school career. And and so at that point I started supporting myself and working as a maintenance man at a 100-year-old polo club to support my literature habit.
You did then do some teaching of fiction and poetry. Then for 7 years you did criminal defense investigation. So this is not where I expected this interview to go, but I'm absolutely fascinated. Right. Why did you do that? How did you get into that? And what was the experience like?
So for a decade in there, when I was in the literary arts, one of the things that happens is you just need to make money to support your art. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking for a way to make some money to support my art. And let me just say, in terms of literature, I went into abstract expressionism and impressionism, staggeringly unpopular forms, and I published almost everything I wrote in magazines that immediately went out of business. And that's because when you are working on the edge of an art and you're working on being the avant-garde, any magazine that's not going out of business is not trying hard enough.
Okay.
They're not on the edge far enough.
Okay.
Right? And so you have to do other things to make a living. And so I did a million things to make a living, but the biggest one was working as a criminal defense investigator. And I did that for 2 reasons. One, it made money. 2, I thought it would result in content that was useful to my writing.
Sure. Okay.
And so I worked for the alternate public defender's office in Santa Cruz, and I worked for an absolutely lovely and brilliant investigator
Mm-hmm.
named Bob Bortnick,
Mm-hmm.
and that rearranged my soul to some extent because I went into that shy, and you
Mm.
just can't interview people night and day about their drug habits and violence and all these things and stay an introvert.
Okay. And you must have interviewed people with some very tough stories.
Yes. And a part of the reason I got out of it ultimately was I just never thought I'd be as good as my boss. I just never thought I'd be that good.
Okay.
But the second reason, there's like 5 reasons I got out of it. But the second reason is you're constantly exposed to things that you will never forget. And you can't look away from them. You have to pay attention to them very, very closely because you're developing a case. And so it's the material you work in as an investigator. And it's just hard.
Yeah. If you can't shut yourself down from it, but actually have to lean into it, that's a whole different experience.
Yeah. I can still flip through autopsy pictures in my head that I don't want to have there.
So then a few things: staffing researcher, lead sourcer. I'm not quite sure what some of these mean. Perhaps some highlights from then before you actually start working at Cisco, because you then start getting more into the people business. And the first role you have when you're doing lead sourcing, it's a lot to do with recruiting or finding people. Sounds like with cold calling that you really had learned not to be an introvert. And then the doorway that went into Cisco was through recruiting. I'm not quite sure how this thread works.
That's exactly right. So in the middle there, I went back and got a master's degree in literature and writing. And when I was coming out of that, my wife and I were about to have kids. And I was like, I need to make more money. And so I started calling around looking for work. I called a recruiter and I said, look, I'm looking for work. And she says, well, what can you do? And I said, well, I've been an investigator. I can find people and I can write. Those are the 2 things I can really do. I can interview people, find them, and I can write. And she says, well, you're good on the phone. Do you want to be a recruiter? I said, what's a recruiter? And so I became a recruiter. And I actually set up my own business as a recruiter, and I was terrible at it. I didn't know the first thing. I just didn't. So I decided I needed to get trained, and I went into staffing research. Staffing research is before LinkedIn, you called people on the phone, and you would extract over the phone their entire resume and write it down. And so the measure of success there was, could you get over the phone somebody you've never talked to before? Can you get their entire resume and their life story?
And having just been a criminal investigator, that probably was relatively easy for you at that point.
It is a specialty, and it took me about 3 weeks to get there. But I ultimately had a 3% decline rate. So I only had, less than 1 in 20 would not do it.
As you go into Cisco, you are still a recruiter, but then you start process consulting.
How'd that happen?
Exactly. I seem to be asking that a lot, but love that.
There's a lot of career transitions for me. I was in the arts, but I come from a family of scientists.
Okay.
And so I can do science. I can think that way. And I was very interested in thinking other ways and working on aesthetics and working on art. But when it comes right down to it, I can do that stuff and I enjoy it. I enjoy analytical work. I really do. And I love, if you're going to ask me like the one thing I really want from work, I want to discover the unknown. And so that's either the avant-garde in literature or it's scientific, but that's where the unknown is. And so what happened was I was working as a recruiter in 2000 when the dot-com bubble burst, and I was working for Cisco Systems. In high tech, we haven't seen a downturn like that since. That was the recruiter apocalypse. I mean, recruiters always go first, and so what happened was I'd been working in the semiconductor capital equipment industry, which fluctuated at that time every 2 years. You'd ramp up staffing and then you'd fire everybody, and then you ramp up staffing and you'd fire everybody. And so I knew what was going on when I saw the dot-com bubble burst. I'm like, time to change jobs. And so what I did is I'd been in talks with the team that was designing the staffing system, a new one from scratch at Cisco. I just went over there and I found this little, it was between a wall and a cube. And it wasn't a full cube's width. It was really tiny. And I found this really narrow desk and I dragged it in there. And I took my phone and I stuck it in there. And I got a thing and I put my badge on there and I just started working for them. And it took us 4 months to figure out who from the recruiting organization was going to be fired, laid off. And by the time that happened, I had become an integral part of a team that was working on something strategic. And many of my best friends come from that team in my history of work. And it turned out, I was an okay recruiter. I don't love sales because I care a lot about truth. And I found it a burden. Whenever I called somebody on the phone, I'm like, look, I'm really sorry to bother you, and I meant it. I really didn't like bothering people. And so I found a home in analysis that I was really good at and that didn't come at the same sort of emotional labor.
Okay.
And that was the beginning of that career, which was business analysis, user interface design, and then change management, and then process improvement, and then ultimately business architecture. So I went through the whole sort of stack of analytical disciplines.
All very much associated with people, interestingly, of course, which ends up where we are.
I think it's a beautiful space. If you were working in manufacturing, that could be pretty cool. But working in a space that actually works with people is much more luscious because it's much harder.
It's 2010, you're getting into HR transformation. Was that the draw of putting the process together with the people? When was the evolution of your theory, because I know that it's been at least a decade, of this focus on humans in a framework of process, and also very much to do with this idea, which I find fascinating, the idea of work as a product?
Each step in my career has been toward treating a larger piece of business. And so as a recruiter, I was dealing with transactions, and then I started doing staffing systems. So now I'm thinking about how do all of those things work in a more general sense. And then I found that building tooling wasn't enough. And so there was a user experience problem. The bigger problem could be solved if we got that right. Well, it turned out that wasn't it. The next bigger problem was change management. And that wasn't complete. Actually, it went process next. So then I went into Six Sigma, and that's a very generalizable tool. It's a very, what I would call a horizontal skill. You can apply it to anything.
Okay.
But then it was working on that. That wasn't solving the problem either. So then it went to change management. And where it ultimately led me was I spent about 4 years facilitating almost full-time executive strategic planning, or they were really not exactly strategic planning. They were more like design sessions where we were designing the organization. People would ask me to just facilitate things on the fly. And this group asked me to facilitate something on business architecture. And I had never heard of business architecture. And I was like, sure, I'll facilitate that. And I just got exposed to it. And I was like, that's the thing. That's the thing.
Okay.
These are the people who are thinking about the company absolutely whole. And where I am most interested, and I think this will resonate with you, I'm very interested in how large systems create experiences for the individuals in the system. And so imagine large systems being an artistic medium and creating an experience for the people who exist in them. How does that work? And so business architecture I loved because the methodology is, well, first, we tried to invent it ourselves, which I love to do. Like, let's invent the methodology from scratch. That was a bad idea because it's an existing methodology. You don't have to invent it. But having had the problem and trying to invent it from scratch because the company asked me to, then when we adopted a methodology, which was called Boast, I was like, oh, yes, that's exactly the thing.
Sure.
And business architecture is beautiful because it recognizes that companies are n-dimensional. They're so dimensional that humans cannot observe them whole, because our brains can only handle about 3 dimensions at a time, maybe 4 if we're lucky. And so the fact that companies are so n-dimensional, so what it does is it develops these models of how the company works end to end. And on the back end, in the database, you've got all the dimensions. But what surfaces are these different views of the company, and you can rotate through them and see them. And it's just a spectacularly fun thing to figure out how to do. And we were very lucky, which was that human resources had not been deeply analyzed from a business architecture perspective. It hadn't been modeled. And so the company that came in to work with us, which was called Proact, they had a bunch of models because they'd worked with a bunch of companies in the past, and they brought their models with them. Well, HR hadn't been modeled. And so we got to build those models.
And how big is Cisco at this point?
It was probably 80,000 at the time.
Okay.
60. It depends. It was a couple of years. It probably went from 50 to 80 in that time. I can't remember. There was a lot of growth.
So you go from the business architecture, that was before the HR transformation, or that was part of it?
Yeah, the HR transformation team that I led, it had business architecture, it had the portfolio management team, it had the HRMS system, it had process improvement, but I loved business architecture, and so I always talk about that.
What did you find was the biggest challenge, the most difficult disconnect between the architecture that you came up with and the implementation with the actual humans in the company?
So business architecture is a coordination problem. That's what you're trying to solve. And so the problem is business architecture is only used when a company is going through a significant transformation. And that means going into a new market or switching markets or a new route to market. And Cisco was doing a lot of those things. And so business architecture is designed to figure out when a company is going through that kind of transformation, what are all the operational capabilities that need to change in what sequence to be able to hit what you're trying to do next? So what that meant was that out of 280 categories of work in the company, 65 of them were going to have to transform fundamentally for us to make it into the new market. And they had to transform in a coordinated way. Well, that's just enormous. And so, we broke it down into pieces and we started working on those pieces. But but the hardest part was keeping everybody okay, so you're in a system and you are being asked to change your piece. But every piece of the system is not fully aware of how they fit into the system. Into the larger system. So I'm asking you to spend a year transforming your organization, and you have to take it on faith that this is all part of something larger. It's very hard to communicate. So that's one. Yep. The second thing was that in business architecture, you have to translate business need into architectural solutions. And so there's a translation challenge, which is you're now IT, and I'm what's called an operations view, an O view business architect. I need to communicate to you strategic capability requirements, and you have to translate that into technology systems and technology architectures. It's just a huge lift translationally.
From a strategic point of view as well, when you may not be given that kind of strategic purview.
And I'm going to have to talk to you in incredibly vague terms. I mean, I can tell you all the capabilities that we need to have operationally, but you have to translate that into very deep ideas in terms of the architecture.
And do we talk the same language?
No. And there's another problem when you're a business architect, which is that you very quickly become incomprehensible to everybody because you develop this really quite beautiful to you language for how to talk about these things. So that's a problem. And the second problem is because you're so strategic, you look like you're never doing anything.
Right.
So these incomprehensible people who never get anything done,
Yeah.
and yet tell us what to do.
Yeah, I did strategy for a long time. So yeah. To what degree are we all needing a business architect right now, even prior to Gen AI coming along? All the technology which has been changing the nature of business, been changing how we need to work, be changing how we need to think about work and project work and non-routine work and all those things. Business architecture that should be the how of work that we have never designed either strategically or tactically. Is that what we're needing right now? Every single one of us, every single company?
Yes. And particularly in business architecture, change arrives at companies from two directions. One is what I described before, which is that there are market changes, which is that we're dealing with new customer needs and we're trying to create the capabilities to serve those needs. Well, the other place it comes is new capabilities coming through technology. And so we're in one of those situations, which is that it's not that the market has changed, it's that we have this brand new capability that's entering at the bottom of the model that's going to create new capabilities. And the only thing I would say is that business architecture is wise, but it's slow.
And we don't have time.
And no, we don't have time. And it's going to require a ton of experimentation to even figure out what the capabilities are going to be. And so what we would like to have is a bunch of people who already know the answers about business architecture and the implications of this technology. But I don't think it's weird because frequently the pace layer of technology is the slowest thing. But in this case, the pace layer of technology is very fast.
Yes. Don't you think that it's also because of the technology driving all of these changes that it is actually also very much affecting our customers in terms of customer behaviors are changing, and then our competitors are integrating new different technologies, which is changing how they're serving and delivering their products and services to their customers' behaviors change. And so the cycle is both internal and external.
Yes.
Now, work as a product. How did your thinking evolve to reframe it like that?
For the first 10 years of working in HR, I subscribed to the traditional model of HR. And the traditional model of HR is that employees are inputs to production who must be acquired. And I say that, and it sounds very harsh. When I'm being harsh, I'm talking about me and the things that I believed. We speak of people as resources and assets and human capital who are acquired, which means ownership and all of those different pieces. The truth is, those metaphors they're not just metaphorical, they are how we think operationally. And I was working very hard to build capabilities for HR to be a successful procurement and maintenance function, which is what it has been for the last 20 years, 100 years. I didn't like it. And so even though logically it's what I arrived at, I didn't like the implications of it, which is the implications are that if you're an input to production and my main objective is to make you productive, then if I can make you productive by being happy, great. But if I can make you productive and you're miserable, great. It's not a concern.
Because the function of the replaceability, that is not taking a long-term strategy. If you leave, whatever. Or we lay you off.
If you're productive, it's beyond the scope of my concern. And so then there's a lot of arguments that people make, which is, no, happy people are productive. And I think that's insufficient. Because basically it says, well, if I can make them productive without being happy, is that okay? And the answer in that model would be, yeah, that's okay.
But surely only as long as they stay.
Only as long as they're productive, right? And part of being productive is staying. And so, but just argument, just the fact that I have to make the argument that the only reason I'm going to care about a human is because of what they give me as a company, it just struck me as like ethically flawed. And yet, every time I had to make a business case and every time I had to make an investment decision, that was the driving force. And I ran the portfolio organization. And so we were looking at what we were going to invest in. And we'd say, well, look, if this is how we have to make decisions. We were working on business architecture and we were building out the models for HR. And a funny thing happened, which is employees showed up in two places in the models. They showed up inside the company as inputs to production, but they showed up outside the company as customers. And my thought at the time was, that's at least weird, right? But it was also my perception when that happened was, this is going to be a lot of work because it essentially challenged a mental model that I wasn't quite ready to follow through on that, right? And I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I saw it and I thought, this is actually quite important potentially. So then I was working on a patent for Cisco on a multisided market for Internet of Things data. Wow, that was a mouthful. So basically, because I like to discover new things, I like to invent. I was doing patents for fun. And I did one that was proposing a market for data. So the Internet of Things was producing all this data. Well, there were going to be sellers of data and buyers of data. How do they find each other and how do they exchange rights to the data? Well, that forced me to look very, very seriously at multisided businesses and how they were structured. I hope your listeners are geeky because this is some geeky stuff. Multisided businesses, I realized that they explained what we were seeing in the business architecture models, which is that a multisided business has more than one customer.
Right.
And when you have more than one customer, a funny thing happens, which is that customer A has to be satisfied to satisfy customer B, and customer B needs to be satisfied to satisfy customer A. And both of them appear as inputs to the other.
Right.
So if I'm an ad-based media company and I'm an advertiser, readers look like inputs. And if I'm a reader, I may not notice that advertisers are inputs, but they are producing the revenue that's paying the writers who produce the output for me. And that's a multi-sided business. And so I realized that's what's going on here. And what I realized is that the reason so many things fell into place, but one of them is the reason that work is not great is because an entire customer has been forgotten, has been left out of the model, has been left out of the mental model that we're using, and that customer is employees. And yet we are treating employees essentially like things that need to be made productive. And so the answer for me became, and if employees are customers, what are we selling them? We're selling them work. If work's a product, then it's a design problem. And we can apply design tools to design it better. And how do you deliver that? So first of all, let's really research what people want from work. And so I've asked more than 1,000 people, I don't know how many people, marketing questions about what they want from that product so that we can design and deliver it better.
Listening to the podcast, the typical response is mastery, purpose, and what was the third one?
What the books on my shelves will tell you is that what people want from work is autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
But you've dived in much deeper. What are the things that really surprised you as you dived in and explored, not the individual aspect of it, but all the dimensionality of it?
So first of all, when you ask people what they hire their job to do for them, which is what I've been doing, you get about 35 to 40 different answers. Okay. It's not that everybody, so I'm going to talk about the patterns of what people want, because as opposed to what the individual things are. Let me just say individually what are examples. I hire my job to solve puzzles. So I want my company to deliver me puzzles. I hire my job to give me a worthy opponent. I hire my job to discover the unknown. That's me. Or to invent, or to build, or to give me ups and downs and thrills and adventure, or to give me a stage and an adoring audience. And so there's all these different things that people want from work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's about 35 of them. Well, on average, people want 8 or more. So it's not that people want one of those things. So one of the patterns is people want 8 or more. And when you have 35 things, like that, if you ask 100 people what they want from work, what pattern of those things they want, you'll have a small handful, maybe 4 who want the identical thing as each other, but everybody else is uniquely different.
Right.
And so the traditional model of HR has said, you're an input to production. We'd like to make you act like an input. And so what we'd really like is we'd like to come up with a formula that we can use to optimize you holistically. And so that's why we're so attracted to these lists of 3, like autonomy, purpose, and mastery. But your purpose is not my purpose, and your sense of mastery is not my sense of mastery.
Sure.
And autonomy is not even something you hire your job to do for you. It's a cost of your job. And this lack of autonomy is just one of the costs.
Okay, yes.
Lack of autonomy is just one of the costs. And there's lots of other costs like social anxiety or status threats or your commute or physical risk to your health and safety. There's all sorts of costs. And so when you add this all up, nobody's the same.
Mm-hmm.
There's no 2 people that want exactly the same thing. And that's a really interesting design problem.
It certainly is. I see enormous numbers of problems, including how to do it. HR has not been tasked with this. Managers aren't trained for this. They're not trained for almost anything, and certainly not this. Let's just, for a second, focus on managers who are leading a team. And if they were to take on board this idea, with the amount of time or the business capabilities that they've been focused on up to this point, how can managers make that transition, that mental shift, which is the first thing, I imagine, to be thinking about it in this way in order to be able to just start with the idea of designing things differently?
Yes. You're absolutely right that managers are very, very central to this as a design solution, as a human-centered design solution. And so there are a set of things that almost all people who work at companies want in common. They want to be paid fairly. They want their pay to be accurate. They want their benefits to be reliable. Those things can be served from the center of a company, which is everybody wants the same thing. Let's serve them. There's lots of opportunity for scale.
Right.
The question for all of this variety of what people want, how do you deal with that? Well, the answer is, although the traditional model wanted to stand way back and treat this as a math problem and as a supply chain problem, design wants to get close. That's the way design works.
Okay.
In fact, let's talk about Empathy Works, your book. So design is not about treating people as atoms who need to be optimized. Design is about empathy. It's about getting close and understanding each individual's needs. And the question is, how do you scale that? And the answer is, you already have the tools, the scale in place, which is you have managers. Now, here's what managers, how they transform. And this is the fundamental change. Managers go from being controlling above in an org chart to being below in the org chart and in a supporting role. And they are designers. And in fact, you can even say product managers. And they are brokers. And so as a manager, I am acting as a broker between 2 markets. One market is the demand for the labor of the team, so the value that flows toward the traditional customer. And the other market is the market for work and the work that people want to do. And so a part of my job is to win the kind of work that my team wants to do and then allocate that work with intense sensitivity to what each individual is looking for in work. What's marvelous about this is that economy has never been optimized before. So that economy which is the way it works today. It's almost like if work were a product, if shoes were sold like work, you'd go into the shoe store and you'd get a random box off the shelf and you'd walk out with it, whether it fit you, whether it was your fashion, no matter what. And that's not the way shoe stores work. Shoe stores invite you in and they look at your shoe size and they have you try things on and you walk out with shoes that work for you. That's the opportunity at work today, which is that we've only been allocating work based upon what you can do for me, as opposed to recognizing that there's enormous variety in what people want from work and allocating it with awareness.
And at the same time, it's an enormous logistical challenge. We have 8,000 things that we have to get done to make this business operate. And you, Dart, can do, let's say, 25 of them, and I can do, 17 of them, and then Mary can do 43. And how do we put these all together so that everything gets done and it's coordinated in this very, very individualized way? If we get down to the task, the business and the business processes, and connecting them with people and their very specific skills, some of which are hard, some of which are soft, some of which we haven't properly identified and created skills ontology and all those type of things, how do we get to that place where we understand the business properly in order to be able to do that?
So, first of all, I'm going to say incrementally. And then second of all, I'm going to say locally. And so there's a desire in the traditional model to know what everybody's skills are. And because I'm running an inventory system for this input to production. And so if only I knew. The problem with people is that I can't tell what their ingredients are. And if only I could know what their ingredients are and get them in a database, I'd be able to do something different. I think that's not true. That's not true. And I say that one of my other patents was on how to manage skills ontologies, because I think it's an enormously fascinating problem, but it doesn't actually get you what you want. What you do is, instead of trying to know everybody's skills at the center in some database, you have managers who know what people's skills are. They know how to allocate people to work, and the people themselves know how to allocate themselves to work in most cases. And so the team works as a whole. It's not the manager controlling. The team itself is working together to match itself to the work. And that's as many brains as you've got on the team. It's a very smart organism. It can do smart things for itself. So that's how it happens, is it happens locally, and it's a learning loop. And so the way my teams have done it, and I teach other teams how to do this now, is we use something and others use something that's called the bubble chart, which actually comes out of my deep history. I invented it when I was an individual contributor. What this does is it asks on a monthly basis how a team is allocating its attention. And so the team gets to ask itself, how are we allocating our attention? And so each category of work that a team does forms a bubble. The size of the bubble is how much of our attention is going to that thing. The x-axis is how important is that work to the business, objective. The y-axis is how much is that our team's unique value that we can deliver. So are we performing our highest, best use is the y-axis. And then the color of the bubble is how rewarding is the work. And so on a monthly basis, we ask ourselves, are we mostly focusing on stuff that's high and to the right? And are most of our bubbles green? And if something drops out of specifications, we have a conversation about a team about how to solve that. And so if something goes into the yellow or into the red, we all try to solve it together. What I want to point out about that is that is a manifestation of a multisided market, which is it's got as many dimensions as it has because it's looking at what the employees want from the work and what the business needs from the workers, all in one place.
With a practical example, let's just say there is something which isn't fun to do, isn't interesting to do. So the desire for everybody to do it is low, but it could be necessary for the business. That's going to help it turn greener because of its importance, even though nobody really enjoys it. If that's the kind of work that has to get done by our team somehow, how does that work get done?
Yeah. So, first of all, you'd be very surprised by the variety of what people want from work. So sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's on the cost side. So somebody on the team this particular project is making them miss breakfast with their kids. And so the cost of that product is exceeding the value of that product for them. And so their bubble turns yellow. And then somebody on my team is in Singapore and says, well, I can pick up that project. That looks fun. And they swap. It's super simple. Sometimes it's deeper than that. Somebody on the team is being bullied by a client. This happened. And so their bubble turned red. And so I went out and spoke to that client and said, you can't do that, and intervened. And then I attended the meetings for a while and it turned green. And so sometimes it's straightforward. But also, even in puzzle, like people who are puzzle consumers, there's going to be a difference, which is that one person on my team liked little Rubik's Cube math problems, just loved those kinds of puzzles. Somebody else on my team loved big greenfield, solve world hunger, never been done before messes. Well, that's just an allocation problem if I can be aware of it. But there are some things that just because of the size of your team, nobody wants to do. At least it's an open-faced sandwich. Everybody can see it. That's yellow, or it's probably not red, but it's red is when things are really bad, but it's yellow or gray. And gray work, everybody says, well, we recognize we're a team, we have to do it. And I've never found any problem saying, okay, I'll do that for now. Somebody will say, yeah, I'll do that.
Okay.
You'd be surprised. It's solvable.
One of the most challenging aspects of bringing in this type of a system is it at the first moment, understanding both a new orientation, but also helping each person understand, recognize their preferences, what they really like doing, understand that much more about themselves, because that is what I find is one of the issues, that we don't know enough yet about how we work, what we like doing, and all those type of things. You know some of them. Or is it ongoing process? Is it coordination and compromises between the teams? Never mind senior executives.
It's all of those things. But you're right. People themselves have been trained to be inputs to production. A lot of us go through school thinking, how do I make myself a better input to production, without actually asking ourselves questions about what we're going to love to do. And we end up in places where we just get in that habit. And there are actually people on teams that I've managed recently who said, no, I'm just here to work. Just give me what I need. I mean, just give me what you need to get done. I'll get it done. I don't have to love it. And okay, that's where a lot of the gray work goes.
Yeah.
So people do learn. And I recommend, somebody I had on the show was Bill Burnett, who wrote Designing Your Life. And that's a tool for actually discovering what kind of work you want.
That's a great idea.
And I think that that's a good approach. Leadership loves it because I can roll up to them a bubble chart and says, look, here's where our attention is going. This is how we're making those decisions. Do you agree with the decisions about where we should spend our attention? So it gives them a view. And if lots of things are going yellow or red because of overwork, which can happen, then you can have a conversation about that. And so one of the challenges of being a senior leader is you just don't know what everybody's doing. You just have no idea. And being able to see it all in one place is really nice. It takes practice, and it's iterative for a team to come to agreement on what their definition of business value is. And they can inherit some of that from OKRs or something else, but common understanding of what that means, common understanding of what core to mission for the team is it takes practice and learning. So all of it, and what I say is that it looks like math because it's in a spreadsheet and it's on a chart, but it's not math. It's conversation. And it's a platform for teams to create self-awareness about where their attention is going and have conversations about how to do it better.
And it isn't so much of a burden on the manager because everybody's doing it together.
Correct. It defronts the room.
Right.
Which is, it's a much more collaborative thing. The manager has enormous responsibilities. They're just not the same. They are winning the work. They are helping people to understand what they love. If the team cannot win the work, that some team members want. It's about potentially expanding the scope of the services of the team so that you can.
Okay.
So you are a market maker for
Mm-hmm.
the kind of work that the team wants and the kind of client that the team wants.
A manager's a market maker. Interesting.
And what sometimes comes back as a concern about that is you're going after stuff not based upon what the business needs. The answer is there's a fair degree of uncertainty about what's best for the business. You think you know what's best for the business, but you have to recognize that you don't know for sure. And so within that uncertainty, there's a lot of room to move.
Fascinating. Based on where we are now, the realities of where most companies are now and the skills that managers have, and the understanding that people do or do not have about how they work and what the possibilities are, and that we're in the middle of so much ongoing change, which is not going to stop anytime soon. What is your advice to a leader at any level of the organization to be taking the essence or pieces or tactics, the way you frame this, to be able to work differently tomorrow, next week, and improve things? Because business operations, changing work dynamics are not easy right now.
Yeah. Well, let me say, first of all, I really like the message of your book, Empathy Works. And I like the message because empathy works, right?
It does.
Right? Which is that it's a part of our brain that is a powerful tool for understanding the world. And so I think all of us can do better by using that part of our brain. And so I very much agree with that message. And that empathy should be aimed at ourselves as well. Right? So that's one thing. I think systems are very adaptive if you give them the agency to make local decisions. And sometimes that'll go sideways on you, But change requires agility and dexterity. Was it dexterity? It was something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That how do you make a dexterous organization?
Hmm.
And my answer to that is you let the edges of the organization lead. The edges that are close to the customer, that are close to the problem. It's basically a very Peter Drucker message of give more agency to the agents. I think it's very tempting in times of change to react in fear. And fear can lead to control as opposed to guided emergence, which is what systems do well.
That's a really interesting way to be thinking about it, because the system is in flux. And
yes,
when we have the ecosystem, we need to be thinking about it and how the whole thing is moving. Guided emergence.
I'm very fascinated with guided emergence. I mean, how do you guide emergence? So in a flipped org chart, where the team is at the top and the leaders are at the bottom, what is the role of the trunk and the roots? And it's values and its purpose. And so by constantly anchoring your organization on values and purpose, they are much more likely to have the emergent properties that you want because everybody is acting in those directions. So it's three things, actually, as you go up the trunk. It's values at the deepest root, it's purpose, and then it's focus is the third one. And then beyond that, the organization can take it from there.
Thank you. That was really fascinating discussion. Dot, I really appreciate your time, incredible thoughtfulness, and thank you for telling all the stories and business insights and vision for the future and where we need to go, because it's going to be a bit of a messy ride.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. And your questions made me much geekier than usual. Much geekier, which means I'm being my true self. So I very much appreciate the deep questions.
Thanks again so much to Dart Lindsley, Strategic Advisor, People Experience at Google, and host of the Work for Humans podcast. You can follow Dart on LinkedIn and explore his website, dartlindsley.com, DARTLINDSLEY.com, where you'll also find his podcast, Work for Humans. Immediate action tip. To enable a dexterous organization, let the edges closest to the customers lead. Giving more agency to the agents will facilitate guided emergence, while also anchoring your organization with values, purpose, and focus. For more about the importance of integrating empathy at work, read or listen to my new book, Empathy Works, the Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You could also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular updates, videos, curated useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.